Growing up in a farming town, I heard a lot of advice that was supposed to keep me safe. Don't wander into the woods, don't get into strangers' cars, and don't go near the lamp halfway up Cutty Street. The Cutty Street lamp was half superstition, half urban legend. Just like some people tried not to walk on cracks in the sidewalk or didn't like it when black cats crossed their path, people avoided going through the light cast by that street lamp. During the day, the light was off, and no one paid it any more attention than the other 4 lamps on that street. But after dark, anyone sitting on the low brick fence that bordered the cemetery opposite the lamp would see something very interesting. Cutty Street was the most direct route from the east side of the town to the shops in the center, so it wasn't a quiet road. When I was a child, I liked to sit opposite the light on nights when I didn't have homework. It made 10-year-old me feel like a hero to have my back to the cemetery and my face to the light no one wanted to walk through as the blood-red sunset faded into darkness. I would sit on the brick wall and weave braids out of the long grass that grew there, or pick up a handful of gravel and try to throw it through the third slat in the stormwater drain half a dozen feet away, while I counted how many people avoided the light. Pedestrians looped around the light. Some gave it a wide berth, even crossing the street just to be clear of it, while others walked in a tight semicircle, just barely skirting the circle of light the lamp created on the sidewalk. For most people, it was almost a subconscious action. To be fair, it was a strange sort of light. The other 4 lamps lining the sidewalk cast a normal, warm, white glow. But that particular lamp's light was tinged blue. It wasn't so strong that it looked clearly wrong, but compared with the lamp 20 feet down the road, it was slightly off. My mother was a very superstitious woman, and among her other advice, don't break any mirrors, don't go to sleep in the middle of a fight, and don't play with Ouija boards. She occasionally reminded me to keep away from the light on Cutty Street. When one of her friends saw me there and passed on the news that I had been watching the lamp at night, she panicked, and through tears and threats made me promise not to go near it again. She was a good woman, and I loved her dearly, so I stopped my nightly habit. For the next few years, I saw very little of the light. I still traveled down Cutty Street, usually during the day, and I couldn't stop myself from glancing at the lamp every time I passed it. When I was 12, my cousin came to stay with us for a few weeks. His parents were going through a nasty divorce, and his mother had wanted to give him a break from it. Todd was a year older than me and impressed me as being the height of cool. Todd wasn't an unpleasant person per se, but he was surly and not entirely happy about being turned out of his home. I was overly eager to please and let him have whatever he wanted. After he complained about how uncomfortable the spare mattress on my room's floor was, I swapped with him so he could sleep in my bed. When we watched movies at night, I always let him pick. I tried to introduce him to my friends, too, but they didn't like hanging out with him. "They're babies," he said to me one night lying in my bed, arms folded behind his head as he stared at the ceiling. I don't blame him, though. There's nothing exciting in this town. If they were in the city, they'd harden up real quick. I hated hearing Todd complain about my town, so I cast around for something that would impress him. "We had a murder here a few years back," I said. "A guy killed his wife and buried her in the backyard." Todd snorted. "Just one murder? No serial killers? We have plenty of those in the city." I was deflated, but not deterred. "There's also lots of bears in the woods. We've got to bring a gun whenever we go in there." "I've seen bears in the zoo," Todd retorted. "They're not that scary." Then my brain lighted on the relatively insignificant 6 feet of Cutty Street that had always fascinated me. "We have a haunted streetlight." Todd glanced at me out of the corner of his eye, and I knew I'd gotten his attention. "What?" "There's a lamppost that kills anyone who walks under it." That was, I admit, a pretty big exaggeration. I'd seen a few people walk through the light before, and they'd always shivered and picked up their pace as soon as they realized they'd stepped into the unnatural light. I was 12, though, and trying to impress one of the least impressible people I'd ever met. My cousin had rolled over to fix me with a scrutinizing stare. "You're making this up, aren't you?" "No," I felt offended. "It's real. I can show it to you." "Right now?" "Yeah, sure, whatever." And just like that, we rolled out of our beds, pulled clothes on over our pajamas, and snuck out the back door. My mother watched TV in the front room of the house in the evenings, so it was easy to climb over the backyard fence and into the lane that ran between the houses without her knowing. From there, we could follow Roger Street toward the city center. I knew my mother would check on us before she went to sleep, but that wouldn't be for another hour at least. And I hoped I could show Todd the light, prove that our sleepy little town could be just as impressive as his stupid city, and get us back into our beds without my mother being any wiser. Todd was showing more interest in me than he had since he'd arrived. He asked about the lamp, and I told him about its blue sheen, the cemetery it sat opposite, and the way no one walked through its light. I led Todd to my familiar seat on the cemetery fence, and was pleased to see it had hardly changed in the years I'd been away from it. I sat and waited for Todd to grudgingly sit next to me, then pointed to the lamp on the other side of the road. "That's it," he said, skepticism lacing his voice. "Doesn't look that scary." I was miffed but tried not to let it show. "Can you see the blue light? It's darker than the light down that way." Todd squinted between the two lights, not looking impressed. "Maybe a little." "Well, just wait," I snapped. We did. It was a quiet night, and Todd was becoming fidgety by the time a woman entered the street from a side lane and began walking toward the light. I poked my cousin to get his attention, then nodded to the lady. She had her hands in her jacket pockets and was watching the road in front of her, apparently absorbed in her own thoughts. Just as she approached the edge of the light, though, she changed course and stepped onto the road. We watched as she walked in a neat semicircle, leaving at least a foot between herself and the glowing circle cast on the concrete, before returning to the pathway and continuing on our journey. Todd didn't say anything, but he didn't take his eyes off the woman until he'd seen her walk straight through the light cast by the normal lamp down the road. Then he turned to me. "Okay, that was cool." I kept my face serious as I nodded, but I was rejoicing inside. "Okay, we can go back now. There's still 15 minutes until Mom's program ends, so if we hurry—" "Not yet." Todd slipped off the brick wall. "I want to check this out." Nervousness fluttered in my stomach as I followed Todd across the road. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. We can't hang around. If Mom finds us missing—" "Shut up. This will only take a minute." Todd paused just outside the circle of bluish light, staring up at the lamp. I hovered 10 feet away. I'd loved watching people circumnavigate the light, but I'd never considered passing through it myself. Todd spent half a minute staring at the lamp, then stepped directly into the light. The blue glow cast strange shadows on his face, giving him a sickly gray pallor. His eyebrows pulled into a scowl as he turned to look at me. He opened his mouth but closed it again, apparently deciding against whatever he'd been going to say. He looked a lot less comfortable than he had a minute before. "Okay," I said, anxiety seeping into my voice. "You've seen the lamp. Let's go." Todd looked upward. His eyes widened as he gazed directly at the light. Then his face contorted. A horrible high whine filled my ears, and I realized it was coming from Todd's open mouth. He seemed to be trying to scream, but he couldn't get the noise to form properly. His eyes bulged, and sweat beaded over his forehead. Every muscle in his face strained, and veins stood out over his forehead like purple worms. Tears started to leak from the corners of his eyes, mingling with the perspiration on his cheeks, as he stared directly into the light. I screamed his name, but he either couldn't hear me or couldn't react. His jaw stretched wider, and the whine became higher, then cut off abruptly as Todd went completely limp and crumpled to the ground. My heart beat painfully in my throat as I stood frozen on the sidewalk. Todd wasn't moving, and he was still inside the circle of light. The entirety of my being screamed against the idea of getting any closer, but I couldn't leave Todd. I squinted, my eyes nearly closed, lunged forward, and plunged both hands into the blue-tinted glow. In that terrible second that my hands were inside the light, I felt it. The air was charged with a faint electric current. My skin prickled and the hairs on my arms stood on end. I felt like what I'd imagined radiation would feel like, but at the same time, it had an otherworldly sensation, like that column of air belonged to a different plane. My fingers seized the back of my cousin's jacket, and I hauled him out of the light as quickly as I could. I dragged Todd at least 10 feet away from the lamp before rolling him over to look at him. His face was frozen in that horrible grimace. Eyes open, a small smear of blood marking where his temple had hit the sidewalk. He was as pale as a ghost and completely still. My memories from the rest of that night are disjointed and strange. I don't know if I ran for help or if someone found us, though I suspect it was the latter. I have a clear image of riding in the passenger seat of our car as my mom drove in the wake of the wailing ambulance. As tears ran down her face, I realized I'd done something unforgivable when I told Todd about our lamp. I remember sitting in the waiting room, listening to the doctor explain to my mother that my cousin had suffered a massive cardiac arrest and died at the scene. Todd had only been 13. He'd been healthy and active and had no history of heart problems. My mother turned to look at me, her eyes swimming with grief and terrible knowledge. Neither of us dared say it, but we both knew the light had taken Todd's life. I never went near the street lamp again. If I needed to get to the center of town, I took a longer route to skirt around Cutty Street completely. I never spoke about it, didn't let myself think about it, and tried to ignore the persistent nightmares. It was a relief when we moved to a different town some years later, though it looks like I'll never completely escape the light. I'm 26 now, and was recently diagnosed with cancerous growths in both of my hands. The doctors say a combination of surgery and chemo have a good chance of being successful, but I don't think the light will let me go that easily. I've had an idea lately, a crazy idea about making a pilgrimage back to my hometown. My mother passed away a few years back, so there's no voice of reason to dissuade me. If I'm going to die, it'll be on my own terms. I want to go back and see the light again. I want to stand in its light. I want to know, once and for all, what it is. I want to see what Todd saw. It's that time of year again, where the darkness feels that much darker, and every creak and groan of your house feels that slight bit more unsettling. It's that time of year where your sense of fear and dread creeps more deeply upon you, and your fears are suddenly heightened. But there's no need to fear. We have the perfect solution for you. Spooktober 2024 is once again sponsored by VENATOS. As you all know by now, VENATOS offers the topmost quality in gaming equipment, and with their top-rated customer service, you won't have any buyer's remorse nightmares, even if you live on Elm Street. You can avoid the terror of added fees because VENATOS ships free to the United States, Canada, and hell. Well, hell, Michigan, that is. What are you waiting for? Go to VENATOS.com today. Still scared? How about you use code PRESSSTARTMOM at checkout and save an additional 10% off your order? That should keep the monsters at bay. For now.